a lot of people know exactly what lupus is. And so, why don't we start off with when you first found out that you had lupus, and then when you were officially like diagnosed?
Okay, so I am a 30-year lupus thriver. So I've been living with lupus for the majority of my life. It's hard for me to remember a time that I didn't have it. I've had lupus since I was 11 years old, and my lupus journey is somewhat unique because 30 years ago there wasn't a lot of children diagnosed with lupus. Lupus is primarily known as a disease of childbearing age. So 15 to 44 is kind of that spot where most people are diagnosed. But I had a bleeding disorder as a child, and I had chronic bloody noses. And I was actually at my orthodontist appointment. I was being fitted for a retainer. And the orthodontist pulled my mother aside after the appointment and said, "Something's wrong with her.
Hmm.
Too much inflammation in her mouth. She's got sores, and this is not okay." And literally within a few weeks, I was diagnosed with Epstein Barr virus, which is the common virus associated to the development of mononucleosis. I was in sixth grade. And so I went through, gosh, like 6 to 8 weeks of fevers and severe fatigue and joint pain and headaches and all these common EBV symptoms. But what happened was when the EBV went away, the Epstein Barr virus went away, I tried to go back to school, and I was so lethargic. I had fevers that were coming and going. And then I noticed that I was a dancer. I lived at the dance studio several nights a week. I noticed that there was a lot of inflammation, a lot of pain and tenderness in my knees. It started in my knees. And so I went back to the doctor. My mom took me back to the pediatrician, and she said, "Well, maybe you're growing. Maybe, the virus, whatever it was, it's just a little superfluous inflammation. It'll work its way out of your system." They sent me eventually to physical therapy because it was getting even more painful, and I was losing range of motion in my joints, and other joints were starting to hurt. And the physical therapist became alarmed and said, "Your inflammation is spreading. It's going into your smaller joints. You can't lift your arms above your head." And all these other things, in addition to the fevers, I still had the headaches, the tiredness. They finally took blood work at my pediatrician's office. And what came back was one of the highest anti-nuclear antibodies, and we'll probably get into that in a little bit. I don't want to get in the weeds right now, but which is an indicator of systemic lupus and also rheumatoid arthritis. It could be positive for that. So I was first diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, or what some doctors call juvenile idiopathic arthritis, at the age of 11. Then further testing revealed that I had systemic lupus erythematosus.
Hmm. Is this something that runs in a family? Is this something that you can develop from your parents, or was this something that was completely new to you and your family?
A great question. There's a lot of mystery behind lupus, how people get it. They're still kind of peeling back the layers on it, though it's not considered a genetic disorder per se. There are dozens of genetic variances that they have discovered that are linked to the development of lupus, and two-thirds of those with lupus are women of color. I am Mexican American, so that is a part of it. I also have a health history of my family having rheumatic illnesses. So for me, it was really a perfect storm of all these things coming together. And then the virus was the catalyst. It was the tipping point for my immune system to turn against itself.
Yeah, and I only ask because I know RA is kind of something that you can develop from your parents and stuff like that. And maybe describe to us, what was it like growing up with lupus? I mean, you're only 11, and so at this time, I'm sure it can kind of be like, it's got to be a confusing time just in general as a kid, right? Like you're trying to figure out, friend groups and all this other stuff, but now you got this diagnosis of lupus. So I guess maybe describe what it was like growing up with that.
Yeah, it is extremely challenging to be a child or a teenager or young adult living with a chronic illness. There is no resolution. It's one thing for someone. This is what I call the chronic conundrum when you're diagnosed at a young age. It's one thing if someone is diagnosed with appendicitis or they ripped a meniscus and they have surgery, it heals, and you move on with your life. There's resolution. And usually, your friends, your family, everyone kind of rallies around you. You have the surgery, or maybe you have your appendix out, and people bring flowers and food and stuff. But with lupus, it's chronic, it's ongoing. There's never any resolution.
Mm.
Me in the hospital, I was diagnosed, then I was hospitalized for 6 weeks. You see your friends rally, you see your family rally and other support groups, but then what happens when you're in the ER 3 times a year, or you're having 4 surgeries a year, or you're in the hospital multiple times? People have an innate desire for resolution. So what happens is people kind of move on with their life. And when I was in the hospital, I was in the hospital for these long stretches of time. My longest stay was at Children's Hospital Los Angeles for 5 months. 5 months. So it was hard because all my friends had moved on. They were in cheerleading, they were in school plays, they were doing sports. And I was just merely trying to survive,
Yeah.
trying to get through each moment of each day, not knowing what avalanche of symptoms was going to present next, not knowing how the new medication was going to affect me. My friends were thinking about prom, and what clothes they were going to wear, and the note they were going to pass to the boy that they liked. I was thinking about, will I be able to walk today?
Yeah.
Am I able to get out of bed today? Those sorts of things. So it really presented this chasm, and you feel yourself constantly trying to navigate the quote unquote sick world at first and the normal healthy world.
Mm.
And it's this constant because you don't feel like you belong to either. So it can be really challenged, not just physically, but this emotional and social challenge as well.
I can imagine. I mean, just going through all that. And you mentioned that you're in and out of hospitals. Does that mean that lupus kind of comes in waves? Because I know lupus is an autoimmune disease, but and so I've heard commonalities between lupus and MS. And so, do you go through exacerbations similar to that of MS?
Yes, lupus never goes away, but you can have times of quiescence or what we call remission, where the disease never leaves your body, but there's no symptoms that are presently there.
Yeah.
Or your labs look stable. They might say you're in remission because your inflammatory markers are low, or the medication is doing what it needs to do, but it never goes away. So lupus, as we know, is an autoimmune illness. So our body makes these autoantibodies that attack our healthy cells by mistake. And with systemic lupus, that can happen pretty much anywhere there's connective tissue. And that inflammation can cause tissue damage, and that tissue damage can cause organ failure. And at its worst, that organ failure can cause death. So it's really just kind of putting out a fire here and then putting out a fire here and putting out a fire here. Is it affecting my blood, or is it affecting my joints? Is it causing inflammation in my kidney? So it's just this constant management.
Yeah, and you touched on a good point in just explaining what autoimmune is for people who may not know, and it's just like an attack on the cells in your own body. And so you also touched on an interesting point with it's like inflammation in connective tissue. And for those that don't know, our body's made of connective tissue. I mean, that's what we're entirely made of, essentially. And so when you have these exacerbations, it can affect multiple parts of the body. So if she starts explaining like, okay, this is going to affect the blood vessels, or this is affecting like my joints, that's why we're not dealing with just like one organ system here, where like a meniscus tears with your knee, you're dealing with many different areas. And I can see how that would be so problematic and be like, did you have a difficult time figuring out whether it was like lupus, or if like maybe your knee just hurts for something else?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
the pediatrician was baffled at first. They thought that I was growing. I was 11 years old, that I was growing pains. And then I thought it was a tracking problem in my knees. And that's kind of that combination is what sent me to physical therapy in the first place.
Right.
And with lupus, there's not one single blood test that shows, bam, you have lupus. There are multiple tests. And kind of a lot of it comes down to a process of elimination. And it's saying it's not a tracking problem. It's not growing pains. It's not this. It's not that. It's not that. And so they have to go through this protocol And the American College of Rheumatology has 11-point criteria for diagnosis. And you have to have, I believe, 4 of the 11 to quantify that.
And how long does it typically take for someone to first start showing symptoms to the time of diagnosis? Because um, it seemed like I don't know how long it took you for your first initial diagnosis, but I can seem like getting this runaround of like confusion of trying to figure out what's actually going on. So how long did it take you to figure out to actually getting an answer from the first time you experienced symptoms?
Well, I can tell you on average, it takes lupus patients 6 years to get diagnosed. And that is really a scary statistic because of the way lupus can travel and the way that it can affect multiple vital organ systems. So, a lot of times, by the time someone is appropriately and accurately diagnosed, there's already organ involvement, particularly in communities of color. Now, for me, when I told you I was first diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and they kept saying, you have an autoimmune connective tissue disorder. You have an autoimmune connective tissue disorder. But there was hesitancy to diagnose an 11-year-old with systemic lupus over 30 years ago.
Mm,
I didn't know anyone who had lupus that was with me in Children's Hospital until later on, like 3 or 4 years later. So it was, we don't want to say the word because they knew what that word meant 30 years ago.
right.
Was not a lot of treatments then, and there's still not a lot of treatments now.
That's interesting. And management of stress, I know, like you said, you had this scary time in your life where you're trying to figure out everything and you're a kid and other kids are worrying about prom and everything else. And so how did your parents go through a tough time trying to like help because like they don't know what's going on. They don't understand how to, figure it out. And so I guess how did you develop as a person just like maybe from a perspective of psychologically speaking, how did you manage all that? And then also did your parents like take extra steps to help you out? Did they I guess explain psychologically what was going through your mind through that time and how you advanced to the time maybe like into your 20s?
Mhm. Well, I feel like there's two parts there. The first part I want to say is that I was raised by a single mother
Okay.
who was incredible, and she did everything within her power to get me to the right doctors and to seek treatments. And she stood by my side. I mean, golly, we lived in Orange County, California, and I was hospitalized in Los Angeles for 5 months. And she would work a full day, drive up, stay the night with me in the hospital, and go to work the next day wearing the same clothes she did the day before because she needed to be with me. So, to all those working parents out there who are living with a child who has a chronic illness, I applaud you. I applaud you. You have to tap into a strength that is absolutely incredible and honorable. And so there's that point. The other thing was when I was at Children's Hospital Los Angeles for that 5-month appointment, I had someone come into my room. This was really a turning point. It was those are teaching hospitals. So I had an intern come and sit down on my bed and say to me, I feel really sorry for you because you're just going to live a life in a wheelchair with a breathing tube eventually down your throat. And then he walked out and he checked something off in his chart and he left.
Jesus.
And as traumatizing as that was, it made me mad. It made me say, I am more than whatever you just read in your chart. And for you, a man who barely knows me, come in here to make assumptions about me and to tell me what my life was going to consist of, sorry, I am not a sum of everything that is wrong with me. And I have a voice. And it was in that moment where I started a process of I have to take my life by the reins, even in my teenage years, going, this is going to go either two ways. This illness is either going to destroy me, be destructive, and make me bitter, or this illness is going to be challenging, yes. I have to step up and be better because of this. And so that kind of started this snowball effect in my life of viewing who I was and my illness differently. No longer viewed myself as a sick person. I switched the light on, said, nope, I'm going to manage this. And I think that's a huge milestone for someone living with a chronic illness to step out of the sick clothes and into, I'm the manager here.
Mm.
And it's empowering. And it really helped me. That mental game really helped me in my life.
And was it looking back at that experience in retrospect where you noticed that, or was it at the time that's exactly how you were thinking?
It was live or die in that moment.
Yeah. And so what were the next actionable steps for you? Like I guess what were the next things that you started to do? You know, you're realizing you have to change and you have to change the way you look at this disease and how you're going to manage your life. What were the next steps that you took?
Finding my passion and finding my purpose.
Yeah.
And excuse my language, getting the hell out of that house.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, got to get the hell out of there and away from that guy.
Yeah. Yes. And that's why, I run a nonprofit and it's called More Than Lupus. And that's the reason why it's called More Than Lupus, because we are more than a sum of our lupus hair loss, of our lupus nephritis, that's lupus swelling of the kidneys, of our lupus problems with our heart and our lungs and our joints and everything else that lupus affects us. We are more than that. Every person has passions, and every person, if you have a pulse, you have a purpose. So discovering that and who I was, because I let my illness, which many people do, be the North Star of my life for many years. And it was all consuming. So it is a process of realizing who you are. And yes, lupus is a part of me. It will always be a part of me until hopefully, God willing, there's a cure. But it's woven into the tapestry of my life. But there's so many other layers and textures and colors and fabrics. It's not the whole dang quilt. It's just a part of who I am. And it's a process of learning that and figuring that out.
Yeah, you mentioned this part of process, and I guess for people who may be in a similar situation, or maybe they have a different disease, I guess what are some actionable steps they should take forward? Because it's easy for you, now in retrospect, having gone through so long, to be like, hey, like you need to find your purpose, you need to not get over it, but you're simplifying something that is a very monumental part in your life, and I'm sure somebody else's. And so I guess for someone saying like, oh, it's easy for you to say, what would be some actionable steps for you to maybe start taking and being like, okay, this is how you need to start thinking, or this is what you need to do in order to start shifting the way you think?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of practical steps to kind of making this manageable and really having that outlook. And I would say number one is, we are wired for community. And unfortunately, this disease tricks you into thinking that you're the only one going through this. You're the only one having these frustrating doctor's appointments. You're the only one up at night because you're in so much pain you can't sleep. You're the only one dealing with all these tests and all these different things. So realizing that there's a community out there of people who have similar experiences and who are successfully managing an illness is a defining moment, and a very important practical step is to getting involved in a community of lupus thrivers or lupus individuals who are in this together. So that's number one. Number two is something practical that I do every morning is, instead of before my eyes open, before I step out of bed, instead of counting my calamities, going, oh my gosh, I can't move my neck. Oh, I'm so tired. Oh, my joints are so stiff. I think I have a mouth sore. We start counting our calamities before our day even starts. You gotta switch that around. You have
Mhm.
to say things that you are thankful for. And I know it sounds cliche, this attitude of gratitude, but this is scientifically proven to affect your health, to affect your mindset and your mindfulness, is to be grateful for the day ahead and to be grateful for the things in your life. The last thing I would say that's really important and practical with a disease that fluctuates and you never know what's going to happen next. And, your labs, you can't control your labs, you can't control your flares, whatever. You must control the controllables. You have to be able to say, okay, I'm not able to control what my lab results are going to say today. To an extent, I mean, there's things that you can do to be mindful and proactive with your health, but mainly, looking at it that way. But I can control the attitude that I choose to respond to those lab results, or I can control how much sunshine I get today or don't get today, or how much I do this, or if I'm taking my labs correctly and being compliant with my doctor's recommendations. So it's really control the controllables as well. So those are three practical things. We've got a lot more on More Than Lupus too, if you want to check them out.
And you started talking about some of the symptoms, like like you started going down this checklist of things that are bothering you. I guess what are some of the symptoms that you experience, and then maybe you can go off of that and talk about like what are some typical symptoms that people with lupus generally experience.
Yeah, so my lupus affects my blood. So with that, you can get blood clots, you can have chronic anemia. That's an issue for me. So I've had blood transfusions, things like that. Then my lupus also affects my musculoskeletal system. I've had 4 knee surgeries, all stemming from that first attack on my knees when I was 11. But yeah, it affects my neck. I've had neck surgery as well. Lupus tends to also affect smaller joints, like in your wrists and in your thumb and your fingers. So I've had that problem too. Also, autoimmune illnesses like to party together. They're like, you have lupus at a party, and all of a sudden the doorbell rings, and it's like, oh, hello, rheumatoid arthritis. And then the doorbell rings again. It's like, oh, hello, Raynaud's syndrome. Doorbell rings again. Oh, hello, fibromyalgia. They like to party together. So many of us have multiple lupus overlap illnesses, and that's the case with me. I've got Raynaud's syndrome, which affects the small capillaries and veins and vessels in your hands and your feet. And I also have Sjogren's syndrome, which is your immune system attacking the moisture producing glands in your body. Obviously, I have RA and some of those other overlaps as well. So my main symptoms that I have to manage are fatigue, overall joint pain, my anemia, and then keeping an eye on my kidneys because it's affecting my kidneys and my lungs.
Hmm. And is that a typical presentation for people with lupus, or is it just a very broad? Because, like you said, it covers many organ systems and many things. And so, are there like some commonalities that people should look out for in case maybe they're like thinking maybe I do have lupus?
Yes, so lupus is unique in each person, but a lot of people, about 60% of people at some point will have skin involvement, will have what's called the lupus butterfly rash. And that's a rash that goes around each cheek over the bridge of your nose. So that's kind of a physical manifestation that you can see on the outside, but a lot of lupus manifestations are on the inside that you can't see. And it's really challenging to diagnose in that way. And that's why it's often referred to as an invisible disease. But most commonly, it is pain, fatigue. You can have skin rashes, headaches, um, and then fevers as well from that overactive immune response.
And with so many different places affected, and it seemed like you had some decent doctors early on to figure out like what's actually going on with you. Is it difficult to get a diagnosis of lupus? And do you get this medical runaround? Because you said it takes 6 years for you to get like first experience symptoms to the time of actual diagnosis. And so, do you s- is there this a common trend where it's taking this long for people to actually get diagnosed with it? And are healthcare providers perhaps missing things in the regards to like maybe their evaluation process or the questions they're asking?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when a patient comes in and says, I have pain, overall pain, and I have fatigue, there are so many other diseases and disorders that cause it. And, it gets down to I'm sure you've heard of this, the horse zebra theory. When you hear something prancing around the corner, you don't assume it's a zebra, you assume it's a horse. So lupus is a team zebra disease all the way, where, you know, you have to go through, oh, okay, maybe you're depressed, or maybe it's anxiety, or maybe it's thyroid, maybe it's nutrition, maybe you need to exercise more or eat better, or all these different things. And the patient's saying, no, there's something, I know my body, I know there's something not right. Please, can we dig deeper into this? And oftentimes there's a lot of gaslighting. There's a lot of just being dismissed, being told a patient is a hypochondriac, or that they're lazy, that they're crazy. And unfortunately, this disease is a serious life threatening disease if it's not treated. I mean, back in the 40s, before there was the use of corticosteroids in lupus, people were given a 2-year lifespan after being diagnosed with lupus. This is a serious disease. We've lost 3 people in our lupus support group here in Portland in the last year and a half.
Hmm.
So what can happen is there's this delay in diagnosis or dismissing a patient, and then they end up having organ issues, and those organ issues can affect them the rest of their life. It can even take their life. So there has to be more information and more research delved into lupus research and discovering these nuances about heterogeneity and disease pathways and all of
You said before, it affects multiple organs. And are there multiple different versions, just like how MS is? There's multiple versions of MS. Are there multiple versions of lupus?
Yes. So there's the classic 4, which is systemic lupus erythematosus, where multiple systems in the body are affected, like what I have. Then there is cutaneous lupus, sometimes referred to as discoid lupus, and there's different categories within that skin lupus. There's scarring, there's non-scarring. There's all different types within the skin lupus category. Then there is lupus, which is induced by a medication that's called drug-induced lupus, where you get symptoms of lupus from a inflammatory response from a drug or a supplement. And then there's neonatal lupus, and that's when a parent, a mother, passes on autoantibodies to their newly born child. So those are the 4 most common, but you often can hear about central nervous system lupus, CNS lupus, where that affects the brain and the spinal cord, lending to headaches, cognitive dysfunction, seizures, and also lupus nephritis. Some people just have lupus that affects the kidneys. And that's when the kidneys do not function properly because there's autoantibodies attacking the tissue, causing inflammation, tissue damage, and often it leads to dialysis and a kidney transplant.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, and it's hard not to blame like the healthcare provider, but I can just from my stance, even like just being a physical therapist, trying to figure out like what's actually going on. I'm sure it can be, you could probably run down so many different rabbit holes trying to figure out like what's actually going on with your patient if like you're experiencing so many different issues. Like, is it the knee? Is it the kidney? Is it the heart? I have no idea. And doing all these tests has got to be difficult.
It is difficult. And I'm really hopeful for the future and advances in diagnostics and really looking into biomarkers and understanding what to test for, when to test it, and also making shared decision making kind of the way of the future, giving the patient the right to ask the questions, to ask for tests when they know something is not okay with their body.
Yeah, and where does the research stand? You said biomarkers. What are some other things that perhaps research? There's like some optimism in regards to research for lupus.
I do think there is hope. I think there's a lot of things happening. I team up with the Lupus Research Alliance, which is the largest lupus research program in the United States, and seeing that there's more and more interest to study it, to understand it. I even heard that once we can unravel the mystery of lupus, we will be able to unravel the mystery of most autoimmune illnesses. And so, if we can pour those research dollars into understanding this disease, the more research leads to potential cure, not just for lupus, but for many other autoimmune illnesses out there that have similar disease mechanisms, similar pathways. So a lot can be done, and I'm very hopeful. I'm also hopeful for new treatments in the pipeline, new medications. We had the first ever medication approved for lupus nephritis, lupus of the kidneys, approved just a few months ago. Um, we only have one medication, one that has been specifically designed and studied for lupus patients. Every other medication that's out there to treat lupus was developed for something else and just happened to help with lupus.
Hmm.
So we are hopeful for more medications that are specifically designed for our lupus bodies to treat our disease, not just off-label stuff that's being given to us.
Yeah, and I can imagine how difficult the research has got to be because it's like, where do you start? Like, do you start with the inflammation? Do you start with like making, maybe you should just focus on treatment where you're trying to minimize the inflammation, or you're trying to focus on, you know, getting to a source? Like, what exactly is the source? Like, does it start in the nervous system, and that's why you get this chronic inflammation? So, I is and research is expensive. Is that one of the biggest barriers to entry for this research? Is just like funding and trying to get, or is it more of like on the side of like interest and people like researchers trying to like wanting to solve this issue?
I think it's both, to be honest.
Yeah.
I really do think it's both. Lupus affects over 5 million people worldwide. And quite frankly, I don't think that number is accurate, considering that lupus primarily affects communities of color, and to think of all the indigenous and other populations around the world that don't have access to care. So I really do think it's a higher number than that. But it's more common than cystic fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, leukemia, and muscular dystrophy combined. Yet it's one of the least funded diseases, even though it's classified by the CDC as a widespread disease. Now, why is that? Well, it's incredibly frustrating for doctors to diagnose. Well, how can we fix that? We have to pour into improving diagnostics. And that requires a lot of federal funding through the NIH, through the CDC, through the Lupus Research Program. And we're getting there. We're getting there. But this has been a very, very long and arduous process. Just getting anyone to be interested in this illness.
And you're quite involved with your non-for-profit, but also, are you working closely with doctors, perhaps try to educate them, or perhaps make them more aware with lupus-related symptoms and lupus-related diagnosing, and just to make sure to be on the lookout for it? Because even as like a new grad, I can imagine it being like, well, it's probably not lupus. Like I remember in house,
Yeah.
he mentioned lupus. All like it's not
Oh, it's
lupus. It's
never
not
lupus.
lupus.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Understanding, um, so that first visit, recognizing the signs and the symptoms. And I have teamed up with doctors from all over the country to increase patient health literacy. So I think that's a huge, huge issue we have in the United States. Our levels of health literacy are very low. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know I mean, obviously, lupus is one of the most complex diseases out there. I don't consider myself a lupus expert, and I've lived with it for 30 years. I'm constantly learning new things, constantly going, oh, that's not the way I thought that was, or, all this new things that are changing and growing with this disease. But working with the doctors who truly care about patients and improving patient outcomes, and who are invested in the lives of their patients, is really key with my nonprofit, and finding reliable sources that put the patient first. There's no other agenda. Putting the patient first is really important too.
Now, are rheumatologists or primary doctors kind of like the frontline workers in this? Are these the people who are primarily seeing all these patients, or maybe are they people who are like cardiologists who are seeing them on like the end of like this like 5-year journey? They've been trying to figure out a diagnosis. Are those the people that you're primarily working with, as like primary care and then rheumatology?
Yeah, so usually the first touch point is a primary care physician or an emergency room physician.
Hmm.
It's up in the ER with cardiac incident, or kidney incident, or whatever it is, or a stroke or a seizure. So usually it's the ER or the primary care physician, and then it's this process of elimination, which can take a while. Eventually, hopefully, they end up a rheumatologist, which is the primary physician that treats lupus, inevitably there's going to be overlap with other doctors. You will usually have a team of doctors working together, including your primary, your rheumatologist, a nephrologist, which is a kidney doctor if you have lupus nephritis, pulmonary doctor, a neurologist, depending on where the disease kind of falls and how it presents. You will most likely have multiple doctors that you're
Mm.
with.
Now, are there teams out there that work specifically like with lupus?
Yeah, if you're lucky to live in proximity to a lupus center, some big national hospitals have lupus centers. There's not a ton, but if you're lucky, yeah, you will be able to be seen at something like that. Most of us just have to kind of ping pong around to all of our different doctors.
So I'm thinking of somebody who's just maybe they think they have lupus. They went to the primary once, or maybe they had a cardiac event at an emergency doctor. You're saying the first person you should probably go to see is a rheumatologist, right? Yeah.
Particularly if you are a person of color who has a history of inflammatory diseases in their family or autoimmune diseases in their family.
And do they know
Right
why?
there.
Do they know perhaps why it's seen more often in people of color, or you said Latino, Latina as well?
Primarily, 1 in 250 African American women may develop lupus. But yes, it's primarily Black and Hispanic populations, women primarily, although men get lupus. And when men get lupus, it is really, really intense. So they don't know exactly why it affects primarily minority populations. There is some findings that can correlate um, melatonin in the skin and not melatonin, excuse me, the way that this our we absorb certain nutrients and vitamin D and different things like that, because there's that vitamin D hormone connection to lupus as well. So some of that is beginning to be established, but there's a lot of mystery as to why it affects communities of color more.
Does skin exposure or sun exposure affect this at all? Like,
Absolutely, absolutely. Over 60% of people who live with lupus have photosensitivity, where their body has a problem with apoptosis, programmed cell death, and doesn't function well. And there's an inflammatory process if you're exposed to too much UVA and UVB rays.
hmm.
Lupus patients has a unique UV threshold, and they have to be very careful about it.
And lupus is a chronic inflammatory disease, so obviously decreasing the inflammation as much as possible is something you don't want to focus on. What are some of the steps that you've focused on to try and help minimize your symptoms?
I definitely think it is a mind body connection. Um, the important thing is to comply with the treatment protocols that you and your doctor have set up. And to be honest, if medication scares you or you don't understand how it's going to affect your body, really be open and honest with those questions in your doctor's office or through a portal and ask the questions there. The number one thing that has been clinically and scientifically proven to help with lupus fatigue: exercise.
Hmm.
No other pill you can take. It is exercise. So understanding what that looks like for you, whether it's swimming in an indoor heated pool to, get your blood flowing, to get your joints moving, to help, with all of those neurological symptoms that may develop, whether it's taking a walk outside of peak UV hours, whatever it is, dancing in your garage, whatever it is, get moving is so important. It's the number one thing that's going to help with lupus problems with sleep and also fatigue.
Well, probably mentally too, right? Just like that physical exertion, then after you're just like, oh, I did something hard, and now I feel so much better.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And lowering your stress level. Stress is a number one lupus trigger. So being mindful of your stress, whatever that looks like that you can do in your daily life to incorporate things that help lower your stress level, whether it's meditation or or prayer or reading or whatever it is, journaling, do it. Do it.
Did you ever reach out to like a psychologist or anybody to help perhaps better understand? I know sometimes people have a hard time putting words to emotions, and so I think, especially, it seems at a young age you were pretty emotionally intelligent, and so in that regard, do you recommend people who maybe get an initial diagnosis, maybe reach out to somebody like a psychologist to help with some of these issues?
Counseling, support groups, they're really important because when you're diagnosed with a chronic illness that they tell you you're going to have for the rest of your life, there's a grieving process that happens. You grieve what you thought your life was going to look like. Maybe you're in school and you were thinking that you were going to go one way, you just feel the trajectory of your life is completely taking a different turn. Whatever it is, you do go through that, a little bit of denial, and you go through a little bit of anger, and you go through bargaining. You go through all of those steps of grief, and it's important to have someone who is outside of your bubble to help you talk through and to be supportive in that way, whether that's through a therapist or a psychologist, psychiatrist, or a support group. It's really important to have that support.
And you mentioned triggers. Are there foods that maybe you have to avoid just based off of like creating inflammation? Because I know the inflammation conversation is huge in like the food
Yeah.
community. And so I guess, are there dietary restrictions or things that you try to do to minimize that?
I get that question all the time. What is the lupus diet? When people are diagnosed with lupus, like, do I need to go vegan? Do I have to do paleo? Do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? What should I be eating? And I will say, and I'm fully in support of Mediterranean diet. I think it's fantastic. That's what I try and follow in my daily life. Just a diet that's really rich in omega-3 fatty acids, high antioxidant foods. Um, but each person is born, we get back to this on a cellular level here, with variances in their DNA. And those variances affect the way we process food, the way we metabolize vitamins and minerals. I fully believe that. That's just science. So I think we know when we eat something that doesn't make us feel very good, or we know, yeah, we can have that fried chicken or that fast food maybe once a week. But if I have that every night, I'm going to see this accumulative effect on my energy. It's going to plummet. My joints are going to start to ache. I think we know whether we comply with making healthy choices or not. That's completely up to us. But I definitely feel that a Mediterranean diet is in line with what rheumatologists all over the country have suggested. It's recommended not just for lupus, but for your heart health. And the thing about your heart health is that cardiovascular disease is the number one cause of death with lupus. So you've got to take care of your heart. You gotta take care of your
Yeah. Do you think that it's the lupus that, well, I know that you said the lupus affects the cardiovascular system, but do you feel that because people get diagnosed with lupus and perhaps they feel like there's nothing they can do, that it maybe ultimately leads to higher stress levels and then like lower activity levels and so on and so forth?
I absolutely believe that. I feel I've seen it time and time again. And to an extent, I experienced it in my own life where I was diagnosed and you feel like your life is over. So you start living as though you've already died.
And did
Close the curtains. It takes a while to either say, okay, it's okay to not be okay right now. There's going to come a time where I'm going to have to fight for my life. And I'm not going to let this define me. I'm not going to let it define me and be the end.
now you talked about purpose and, this pivotal moment of like deciding not to be somebody with disease. And I guess, did you start writing things down to maybe start outlining goals and expectations of ways you want to try and combat this and find your purpose outside of being diagnosed with lupus?
Yes. Once I kind of made that shift in my mindset, I stopped thinking that I was the only one suffering as well. Sometimes we when something's happening in our lives, or whether we're diagnosed with a chronic illness or whatever it may be, we think we're the only ones going through something really challenging. But something that I say in our weekly support groups is everyone has their lupus. Everyone has something they're going through, whether it was a trauma in their childhood, or abuse, or an illness, or cancer, or depression, or whatever it is. Everyone has their lupus. And understanding that you're not the only one going through something allows you to have this amplified level of empathy,
Hmm.
where you're able to connect with people on a whole other level. Like, I can look at someone, whether they have lupus or not, and go, they're in pain. I can see it in their nonverbal communication. And then I know just to sit and listen. What's going on? You okay? And it's just this level of spidey sense that you kind of develop. And yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question there, but yeah, it's interesting the things that you start to develop to kind of enable you to live a more mindful life and really use your illness or whatever it is to your advantage. Because I don't really view lupus as a disadvantage. Um, I use it as, like you said, part of my purpose, obviously, but as something that fuels me to be more mindful, to be more empathetic, to be more compassionate, to really connect with those around me in an authentic way. Because we all have stuff going on. We all do. Some of us are more open about it, but we all do.
Did you have to practice being more empathetic in that way? Was that something that you had to really practice, or was it something that innate in you that you felt like it was easy for you to adopt? Because I feel like sometimes it's very easy to get into victim mindset, right? Being like, poor me, like like you said, just kind of isolate yourself and realize like, this is why is this happening to me and only me, and so on and so forth. And so I guess, was it difficult for you to practice that and just be like trying to empathize or relate to other people?
Once you can realize it in yourself, then you can see it in other people and help them as well. Um, yeah, for me, it was viewing my pain differently. There's pain and then there's suffering. And I could realize when I was in pain, physical pain, but yet I was in a suffering mindset where instead of me saying, ow, this hurts, I can't bend my wrist. It's causing tingling. I would say, oh, that's annoying, really irking me. You know, that's the difference where it's like the wording, as simple as it is, understanding that difference between just acknowledging the pain. I'm not ignoring it. I'm acknowledging the pain, but that suffering mindset, and that gets down to whether you view yourself as a person managing that pain or a sick person suffering with an illness. It's all a mental game to me. And once you're able to identify and clarify in your own life the things that you can do to kind of keep you out of that suffering mindset and that sick person mindset, then you can be there to help others.
Yeah, and I mean, you could relate that to anything, right? You can kind of use that to your advantage for anything you do in your life. I mean, like you said, everyone's got their kind of their own lupus that they deal with, and
Right.
I think we're also touching on an idea of like how powerful words are. Like you told that story of that nurse or whoever that was who came into your room and was like, "You're going to be in a breathing tube or a feeding tube or whatever," and I guess it just speaks to like how powerful our words are and like how much they mean to other people when you say them, right?
Yes. Yes. Our words are powerful. And but I would say our silence is even more powerful. Um, I think that listening is probably the greatest gift you could ever give someone. And so understanding that when I'm in a space with someone and I can see that they're really going through a hard time, maybe they're entering a valley of, disease activity and they're starting new treatment, it's all overwhelming. Or maybe it's a loved one who just lost a child to this illness and you're sitting with them in that space, just listening. I think a large portion of being empathetic is just showing up and listening and not trying to fix.
Mm.
Because a lot of people view individuals living with chronic illness as broken. And that's not how I see myself. I don't see myself as less than because I have lupus. I don't see myself as less than because my productivity may shift from day to day based on my symptoms.
Yeah, and that kind of goes full circle into what you said earlier, where like people, like when they have the meniscus tear or they have like an injury, like they want to get it fixed and they get it fixed and everything's okay. And then, you have the flowers and the food and everything like that. It's kind of just like that whole idea of like, put the fire out and we're all okay. Everything's good now. Everything, we can go back to our normal lives.
Yeah. I think people just have an innate desire for resolution and
For
they're
sure.
in chronic illness.
And did you have to practice more listening skills as well? Is that something that you had to work on?
Mhm. Mhm. As a facilitator of weekly support groups, and we used to do in-person support groups because of the pandemic. Now everything's virtual. Uh, I think as a facilitator of a support group, my goal is to listen. My goal is to allow a safe space for people to be authentic and talk openly. Because a lot of times you have to put on this mask when you're around your family or your friends or your coworkers, because disease and chronic illness makes people uncomfortable, and people are uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. So
Mm.
yourself trying to, like, oh, I'm okay. People ask how you doing. I'm okay. I'm okay. Are you really okay? So, and then they come to lupus and they have a safe space to put down the masks and just say how they're truly feeling, give their authentic experience, and be accepted and loved exactly how they are and where they are in their lupus journey.
That's amazing. And you said you're in the Portland area. And so is there like and you were kind of touching on it a little bit. Are there national groups or places that you can go to try and access or like be a part of a community for lupus?
Yes, well, come on over to morethanlupus.com. We'd love to have you, whoever's watching that may be living with lupus or a lupus-like illness or has someone in their life that is. On our website, we offer support, resources, information, ways to get involved in our group, other groups, lifestyle things to really allow you to live your most full life with this illness. Like I said, I'm a lupus thriver. I don't say survivor anymore. I say thriver. And there's a lot of resources there. And I'm happy to connect you with other national organizations that we collaborate with and other resources, whatever it may be. If it's finding a rheumatologist, whether it's information about a new therapy, whether it's trying to figure out the best way to talk to your friends and family about your illness, managing other people's expectations. Maybe the list goes on and on.
Right.
To help.
And you started a non for profit for lupus. And so I guess what was the motivation behind that? Because obviously when you were like 11, you weren't like, all right, I'm going to run a non for profit. So I guess when was your point when you're like, I need to do something different in that I need to start support groups. I need to start this non for profit and this whole um, business model essentially to try and help people with lupus. When did that start? And like, what was your motivation behind that?
Well, when I was in the hospital as a kiddo, there was no lupus support group. I was kind of put in with the chronic kids group. So it was me with CF friends and HIV kids and type 1 kids. And so we were all together. Then I moved to Portland about 10 years ago, and I was told about a lupus support group through an organization up here called Molly's Fund. And it was the first lupus support group I'd ever been to. And when I attended, I went, wow, this is fantastic. There's people who look like me, like in my same age group, who are Hispanic and African American. I mean, I've never been around anyone that looked like me with lupus because
Mm.
I was kind of an anomaly 30 years ago. And when I got involved with the group and I made these relationships, I became a part of this community. Eventually, they had asked me to facilitate the support group. And after facilitating the support group, they asked me to work for them and collect services. And so I went to work for Molly's Fund. And then the creator of Molly's Fund, Molly, she went on to work for another organization and continue her philanthropy efforts in other ways. And the organization kind of shifted, and I felt it kind of went away from being a patient focused, patient driven organization. So I decided to go out on my own and form More Than Lupus, because I had this momentum. We were doing these Facebook Live support chats. There's thousands of people watching them. People were saying this is what I need every week. I couldn't just leave and not continue the work. I'm too connected. I could never leave anyone behind. So I decided to form More Than Lupus as a inclusive, multi-ethnic, multi-generational space that's designed by lupus patients for lupus patients with no other agenda other than to provide resources, information, and community, and to inspire each other through the peaks and the valleys of each of our lupus journey.
That's amazing. And how long have you guys been going for now?
A little over 3 years.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I'm assuming you get more and more momentum as the months go on here, right?
Yes, yes, it's fantastic. We have people, we're now global. We have people from all over the world joining our support groups and being involved with our online events. It's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, and some of these events are just more kind of just getting to know more people and getting involved in the community, I'm assuming.
Yes, each year we shift our focus, and our goal is to see a need and then fill that need. And for the last 2 years, the need has been really addressing lupus in minorities and access to care, barriers to care, improving clinical trial enrollment, um, kind of addressing medical gaslighting, addressing health literacy. So that's kind of been our focus the last 2 years, as well as my continued passion for lupus in children and teenagers.
Hmm.
Because of my experience, because of individuals in our group, that's just such a soft spot to me and something that I'm really passionate about. So we have an event coming up on the 31st specifically about lupus in teenagers.
That's great. Yeah, and I think do you have providers who also take part in some of these things? I can imagine providers would benefit greatly, especially if they're rheumatology or primary care, from the information you're providing. So at least they can become more aware of what's going on. And so, do you have any like doctors or maybe other healthcare providers who are involved?
Oh, absolutely. I reach out, I ask the best of the best, and most of the time I am rewarded with their cooperation, and it's so fantastic. Um, I think I have the privilege to work with the best rheumatologist in the country, and his name is Dr. Don Thomas. He wrote the Lupus Encyclopedia, which we call the Lupus Bible in our community. It is so detailed, it's a comprehensive guide. So I work with him on medical symposiums as well as a weekly post called Ask Dr. T, where patients and viewers can ask questions and he will answer their questions every single week. And the post goes out on Saturdays. So it's a continuing partnership, and I absolutely love him. And I feel very privileged to work with such an esteemed professional on a weekly basis.
That's amazing. And you mentioned this encyclopedia. Are there other texts or things that people can possibly read to learn more about lupus?
Yes, in fact, I'm sure I have some here. I've got the Lupus Encyclopedia here. I wrote a children's book called My Special Butterfly, which is a story and a simple story that allows people with lupus who have little loved ones in their lives to explain lupus in a way that's not scary, but is honoring to children's intelligence and presents information in a factual and simplified way. There's a parent guide there, so that's something I highly suggest. And there is also there's a book called When Lupus Throws You for a Loop, which is a handbook for the newly diagnosed or lupus veteran. That's a great book as well.
That's great. And how about any media? Is there, like, I know you're doing um, the not for profit, and you also have the website, and you're doing things with Dr. T. Are there other, like, perhaps, I don't want to say influencers, but are there people in social media who are also working heavily with lupus and trying to get the word out there to learn for more people to learn about it?
Oh, well, social media is huge and vast, and there's a lot of amazing advocates out there. Um, regarding advocates, if you want to get involved with, there's different categories. If you want more self-help, there's advocates for that, or influencers, I should say, for that. If you want to get involved with advocacy in Washington, D.C., which is a big part of the work that I do, there's advocators for that. There's a lot of different people out there and platforms out there for lupus. But I just encourage anyone when they are researching and they're looking, is it for the lupus patient? Is it driven by lupus patients? Is that the agenda and not self promotion? Like I'm really protective over the lupus community. I just want to make sure that the information they're getting is for lupus by lupus patients and not about selling anything or anything like that.
That's amazing. No, I like it. And, unbelievably, we're already about on an hour here. And so we're kind of closing up
Oh,
with
yeah.
the podcast here. And so I kind of want to finish with a couple closing questions if you feel ready for them.
Ask away.
Cool. So the first question is, if you had the attention of everyone in the world for 30 seconds, what would you say?
Oh my gosh. Um, I'd probably say as much as they could in that 30 seconds. But I think I would go back to kind of the foundation of the nonprofit is that we are more than a sum of everything that is wrong with us. And your value is not in your illness. Your value is not in the things that have happened. Anything you ever have done, anything you ever will do in your future, you are of intrinsic value simply because you're alive. And if you have a pulse, you have a purpose. And don't let lupus or anything else derail you from finding that purpose.
I think that was less than 30 seconds, but I think the world would definitely appreciate that advice. That's great. And now that you had so much time with lupus, you're helping people with lupus, you're involved in the community heavily, you're helping with doctors, and retrospectively looking at everything that you've done in your career, would you have changed anything, and would you have done anything different up until this point, knowing what you know now?
Everything that I've gone through is maybe who I am, yes. Um, Although in those first years, I did let lupus take away at my self worth. Those first years, I mean, I was young, but still maturing and growing psychologically, all of that. But I would encourage those who are newly diagnosed to find the support that they need so they don't get into that shame cycle of I am broken, I am damaged, my life is over. That and um, I would say though I understand now that I've been assigned this mountain to show others that it can be moved. And I truly feel that when you're given a lot, I mean, to whom much is given, much is required. It is required of me to use this for good. I truly feel that it would be negligent if I did not speak out about that, about that you can live a full life with this illness. It'd be negligent for me not to, after what I've been through, because I can see it. I have been given this experience um, to be able to turn it around and help others. It's not the Kelly show, it's not about me, but to be able to help others through it. And if someone's going through a valley at more than lupus and they fall, there's someone to their left and there's someone to their right that are there to help pick them up and guide them through it.
And that's so powerful. I mean, just taking that bad situation at such a young age and turning into something great. I think that's very motivating, and I think a lot of people can benefit from. And I want everyone to know where you are and how to access you. And so my final question is just like, where can people learn more about you? You talk about the website, I guess. How can people access more to you and reach out to you if they need to?
Sure. I would love for everyone to check out morethanlupus.com. It's not .org, it's .com. And you can follow us on Instagram, Kelli Roseta at More Than Lupus, on Twitter at Lupus More, on Facebook at More Than Lupus. And come check out our Monday Facebook Lupus Live support chat. Every Monday, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, we do an hour chat where I talk about lupus updates, talk about lupus research, drug developments, give some inspiration, and then spend the rest of the hour just answering questions and troubleshooting. So please come by, check out one of those. And we have an event coming up. We always have online events that are tailored to the lupus patient needs. So I encourage you to check those out as well.
Kelly, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and hopefully get the word out there more about lupus so people can learn and be more educated on what's going on in the world with lupus.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course.